Talia, which means hello. My name's Kate Adams and I'm a project officer at Uluru, Kata National Park. So, this Uluru Kata National Park is a really special place, and for two reasons mainly. The first reason is that the Aningu culture is still a very, very much alive Aboriginal culture. For a culture to be alive, it means that the Aboriginal people are still speaking their language, they're still looking after their sacred sites, they're still hunting and gathering their traditional foods, they're still practising inma, which is ceremony, and they're still managing the land through the use of things like fire. And so Aningu, the traditional owners, they are still out here at Uluru Kata National Park, and they're still doing all these things. So there is a living culture here. So that's one reason that this place is so significant. The second reason for this place being so significant is that we have a World Heritage status for both our natural and our cultural values. So the first time the park was registered under the World Heritage listing was in 1987, and that was for its natural values, so the geology. The second time was in 1994, and that was it was then listed for its cultural values, so again for that living culture. So we're one of about 21 properties in the world that have a dual World Heritage listing. Now, there's a really long history to this national park. The first national park was actually created back in 1958, but before that, Aningu had their first contact with Europeans, and that contact was with the missionaries. So you had Christian and Lutheran priests coming out into the desert. They created missions in different areas in this region, and they removed all the Aboriginal people from their land and forced them to live in these missions. Now, one of the impacts of that was that Aningu were no longer on their land, and they were no longer managing the land. And so one of the significant impacts of that was a build-up of fuel on the ground. Because they weren't doing their traditional burning practices, they weren't regenerating growth, they weren't reducing fuel on the ground. So over a period of about 30 years, there was this huge build-up of fuel. So that the missionaries happened in the sort of late 20s, early 30s. The first tourists came out to Uluru in about the late 40s, and then right throughout the 50s. And so, two white men were responsible for developing tourism in this area. Aningu really had no control or no say as to what was happening, and that's one of the reasons why the Uluru Climb was created and the chain was put on the rock. And so, lots of tourists came out here, and the main purpose they came out here was to climb Uluru. Now, this upset Aningu, because Uluru is a very sacred place to the traditional owners, and they would prefer people not to climb it. So, first contact with the missionaries, then you had tourism begin, and as I said, at the time, Aningu didn't really have any control as to what was happening on their land. There was a huge environmental impact in 1976 when a bushfire started, and it turned into a wildfire, and that wildfire burnt about 75% of the park, and that was a result of all that build-up of fuel on the ground, because Aningu hadn't been managing their land traditionally for about 25-30 years. So that was a massive environmental impact on the plants, the animals, so therefore habitat, vegetation communities. It was a really significant event as far as environmental management. From that point, the rangers did actually start talking to Aningu about managing the land and the use of fire and things like that. And so a relationship was started to develop. It was at the same time that Aningu started to process their native title claim to get land rights on the land. So that started about 1976. And that went on for about 9 years until finally the government handed back the land rights to the traditional owners. Once they had the land rights handed back to them, they then leased the land back to the federal government for a period of 99 years. And so we're still today in 2013 working under that initial lease agreement. What that established was a relationship between the federal government of Australia and the traditional owners, and we're still here today. We're working together. Aningu and Parks Australia are managing this park together. So I think, there have been lots of different periods of contact with European people. From that contact, there's been many changes on Aningu's life, on their lifestyle, on the way that they can practice culture, look after their sacred sites. So there's been, not just impacts environmentally, but there's been cultural impacts, there have been social impacts. So, a whole lot of impacts on Aningu through European settlement. So Aningu have been using traditional drawings for tens of thousands of years. There's quite a few rock art sites around Uluru and also at Kata, Tjuta. And we're currently working on recording those sites. Some of visitors can only visit a couple of the sites at Uluru, and the ones at Kata, Tjuta are very sacred to the Aningu men, so they're not able to be visited by tourists. But one of the sites that the visitors are allowed to visit here at Uluru, the rock art has been recorded to be between 28,000 and 34,000 years old. So they've been using this form of communication for tens of thousands of years, and it was just one reason that rock art was used. It was a form of communication, so they would leave a certain mark on a cave wall, and that would tell the next Aningu person that arrived that there was water nearby, or there was no water nearby. So it was a form of communication. They taught their younger generation, so young Aningu men who were going through initiation, rock art was used to teach those young men about the Chukuraba stories, about the animals that they could hunt, about areas that they couldn't go and where they could go. So it was also like a blackboard, like a teaching board for their younger generations. And women used to teach the young girls as well. Rock art was used by both men and women. Rock art was also a way where they could record their history. So there's a man here today who's still alive, Paddy Uluru. He remembers, being a really young boy and sitting in a particular cave around Uluru and being told, the Mala story through the paintings on the rock wall. So, he's now well in his sort of 70s, 80s. It's a way that they also teach their chukurapa, their creation stories. They teach their lore. They teach them about the plants and animals, but they're also recording their history through rock art. So they did also draw in the sand. That was another way that they did their paintings, their decorative artwork, their communication. So they'd get a stick or just their finger and they would draw in the sand as well. So traditionally they didn't use paper bark or any form of bark like other Aboriginal societies do in Australia. It was always just on the sand or in the rocks. And they used ochre. They used what was called ochre, and ochre is basically types of rocks that are grinded up and then mixed with water into a paste. And you can get ochres that are, red, yellow, oranges, just all these beautiful colours. And the interesting thing was that you can't find ochre around Uluru. You've actually got to go out into the West Macdonnell Ranges to find the ochre. And so ochre would have been something that they would have had to trade. They may have traded some food for some good ochre. And then when they had that good ochre, they kept it. It was, it was quite almost like a form of currency. It was quite valuable. Your white ochres would perhaps be white stone, but then they would also mix bits of ash and charcoal in with the white to get the greys, and they grinded charcoal and mixed it with water or animal fat to create the blacks. And so that was their main material that they painted with. I guess how their art has transformed to what they're doing today for tourism was that, again, we go back to the contacts with the Europeans. The first sort of Europeans that Anangu traded with out here were the doggers. They were called the doggers, and they were dingo hunters. And they used to come and ask Anangu if they had any dingo skins or dingo pelts. So basically, the skin off a dingo. And Anangu could actually trade those dingo skins for food. But the doggers used to give them things like, flour, bullock meat in a can, strawberry jam, all things that Anangu weren't used to eating and really were quite bad for them, nutritionally. So, but that was the first sort of form of trading that happened between Anangu and the Europeans. Then as the government, the missionaries came in and the government intervention sort of came in, governments then, provided rations to Aboriginal people. They actually didn't have to give anything to receive these rations. But again, these rations were things like flour, sugar, things that, Anangu didn't traditionally eat and weren't good for them nutritionally. So then once tourism started in this area, there were a few Anangu, came back to Uluru and were involved with the tourists, and it came pretty clear to them that the tourists were interested in their artefacts and their paintings. And so Anangu started to create what's called punu, which are wooden artefacts. They started to create punu and paintings on canvas and paintings on bark to sell to the tourists, because they realised that it was a way that they could make white fella money and then buy food and look after their families. And so that whole industry began probably in the sort of 50s. They started to make art. And if you look at their wooden craft, like their boomerangs, their spears, their clubs, women's bowls, the pitties, traditionally they didn't have the burn marks on them. Today, when you go into a gallery here, you'll find all of those artefacts have the burning marks on them, the decorative burning marks. And those decorative burning marks are called walka. And walka just means decorative, patterns. And so they started doing that mainly for the tourists, so that they looked pretty, they looked more artful, I guess, and that's what the tourists liked, and they started buying them. Today, you've got two galleries here. Mariku supports 32 communities in the region, so there's many Aboriginal people painting, making the wooden craft, making baskets, making beanies, making jewellery. So they have found quite a few different outlets, to express their artwork and their style. But also Aboriginal paintings are, slowly they're beautiful and they're getting more and more popular, and they're slowly being recognised for their authenticity and actually being valued to the right value that they should be. So it is definitely an opportunity for Anangu to make an income through their artwork. So many years ago, there were about 200 Aboriginal languages that existed right across the Australian continent. Today, there's only about 20 of those languages that are considered healthy languages, which means that they're still spoken, they're still taught to younger generations. Out here at Uluru, Kata, Tjuta, there are two languages from this area, and they're called Pitjantjatjara and Yankunytjatjara. But Pitjantjatjara and Yankunytjatjara are just two languages of what's called the Western Desert region. And so when I've used the term Anangu, Anangu means the people, and it means it's the people of the Western Desert region. So you could go out to Lyricha country, another language, or Western Arunta country up near Alice Springs, or Yankunytjatjara, Pitjantjatjara, or Nyatjatjara, which is down south from here. Any of those language groups, any of those people within those language groups are Anangu, because they're still part of that Western Desert region. So in this region there were, I think, either 6 or 7 different language groups, and they could all communicate with one another. So, for instance, one of the elders that I work with who spoke to you today, Ezekiel, he speaks 6 Aboriginal languages plus English. So he's multilingual because he had to be able to speak to all his neighbours, say. So if you live in the Western Desert region, you could talk to the people of Lyritja, Western Arunta, Nyadajara. You'd talk Yankunytjatjara, Pitjantjatjara. You had to, because they were all your neighbours, and they were the people that you travelled with, you did ceremony with, you married, you traded with. So they all had to, interconnect and be able to communicate with one another. When the first linguists came out here, the first thing they wanted to do was to create Pitjantjatjara and Yankunytjatjara as a written language, and so that's what they started to do. Is they actually started to form a written language of Pitjantjatjara and Yankunytjatjara. So prior to that, Anigu didn't have books, they didn't have letters, but linguists did spend quite a few years out here, and Yankunytjatjara and Pitjantjatjara are now in a written format. And it's interesting because there are some letters in the English dictionary that just don't exist in the Yankunytjatjara or Pitjantjatjara dictionary, because they just don't have those sounds in their language. Also in Pitjantjatjara and Yankunytjatjara we use what's called a retroflex, a little line underneath a letter, and that tells us how to pronounce that letter. So in the word Uluru, for instance, the R is underlined, which tells me that the R is just a normal English R, so it's just Uluru, whereas the word for home is Ngura, and there's no little retroflex or little line underneath the R, and so that tells me that it's like a Scottish R, so it's Nura, it's a rolled R. So they had to adjust the written form. When they put those languages into a written form, they had to make certain adjustments because of those differences, because some of the letters, some of the sounds just don't exist in Yankunytjatjara, Pitjantjatjara, like the t, the sound t doesn't exist, it's pronounced like a d. So it's Kata Tjuta, not ta. So yeah, it's pretty interesting, the language, yeah.